arrived at this community of Ribeirinho do Santo on the Turuma-Miram River. In the flower house of Senor Manuel, the head of the family, now reunited with his wife and children, son-in-law, brother-in-law, begin the process to make manioc flour. Manufacture of cassava flour. Cassava flour is one of the essential components of the diet of the Brazilian population, notably in the north and northeast regions. From the manioc root, Manihot esculenta, the following are produced: dry, water and mixed flours, the gum or starch, the tucupi, and tapioca flour. Cassava root processing is often carried out using traditional methods, inherited from the indigenous peoples, who were the first cultivators of the species. However, industrial transformation is increasing. The first traces of pestles for grinding cassava in Brazil date back to 2,000 years. The technology of transforming cassava roots into flour is traditional in Brazil and is maintained mainly in the Amazon region and in the Northeast. It is carried out in small rural artisanal units, known as flour houses, with the use of rustic equipment and family labor or local employees. Cassava flour is an ingredient used in the manufacture of various foods, including beiju, known by the Indians as mbaiu, farofa, pireo, and in a large number of Brazilian cuisine recipes. As early as 1551, the Jesuit priest Manuel de Nobrega, writing about his visit to Pernambuco, referred to beiju and flour made by the indigenous people. In the colonial period, manioc flour became part of the diet of slaves and servants of farms and mills, in addition to usually composing the meal of Portuguese travelers.
Quando ela está assim, o miolo dela, ela já está passando do ponto. Aqui já está muito aguado. Quando ela está boa, mesmo no ponto, ela fica toda assim, ó. Ela é sequinha. Tem vezes que você arranca ela para trabalhar, para ela chuta mesmo. Tu pega na massa assim, chega ela dá liga. Aí é rendosa quando ela está assim.
In some regions, in order to make the food less perishable, manioc flour was mixed with dried fish meal, pounded in a pestle. The flour house. Essentially, the flour house is composed of grading system, pressing system, and oven. After the root is harvested, the cassava is taken straight from the field to the flour house, abbreviation, Farinha, where it is peeled or scraped to remove the dark, dirty skin. It is then crushed or grated in a pestle or grater, kaitatu. The grated cassava falls into a trough, being then pressed in the tipitai, TP equals to squeeze and TI equals liquid, in the Tupi language, to remove a poisonous liquid called manipura or manipuera, commonly called cassava water, which is the result of fermentation, in addition to providing the drying of the mass. After sifting and roasting, the flour is ready for consumption. The cassava mass, the starch, which decants during the pubigium, fermentation, is used as starch, to iron clothes, or to make food, such as porridge, sequilhos, cakes and tapioca. In the flour house, the tasks are divided. Generally, the men are responsible for the process of pulling the manioc from the swidden and transporting it to the flour house. Women and children scrape the tubers and extract the starch or starch. The work extends into the night, when the so-called flowers take place. The accordionists, guitar players, dancers appear in between sips of cachaca, coffee with beiju and lots of joy. The work continues all night. Stages of cassava flour manufacturing. The flour manufacturing process can be divided into 9 phases: planting, harvest, transport, cleaning, grading, pressing, crumbling, sifting, roasting. Planting. The best time for planting is the beginning of the rainy season. In most of the Brazilian southeast region, the seedling should be planted at the beginning of January. With 9 days it sprouts. Harvest. For the best yield and for the best quality of cassava, the harvest should take place between 1 year and 4 months to 1 year and 8 months after planting. Transport. Cassava ferments very easily at room temperature after harvesting, and roasting or refrigeration is used to prevent fermentation. The deadline to avoid the start of fermentation is 48 hours, because in conditions of greater heat or humidity the period can be reduced, and the cassava darkens, beginning of fermentation. And once grated it can ferment, sour, in less than 24 hours. Since this period has great weight in logistics calculations, requiring a deeper reflection on the distances between the place of harvest, the place of distribution, free fare, and processing, flour house. The hygiene of the workplace, tools and implements, workers and the storage and transport place are necessary to obtain a quality flour, remembering that in rural areas one must redouble the concern with rodents and insects. Cleaning. The root needs cleaning for 2 main reasons: to reduce hydrocyanic acid, HCN, producing agents, and to remove soil. Washing with clean running water may be necessary to remove the soil encrusted in the root and possible contamination from the soil. After washing, the cassava must be peeled to remove the fibers from the bark, the hard parts of the stalk near the stem, and part of the poison. The linamarin and the ethylmethylketonecyanohydrin found mainly in the root bark and in the cassava leaf undergo hydrolysis during digestion, turning into the highly toxic hydrocyanic acid poison. Equipment. Ball or peccary used to grate cassava. The utensils most commonly used in the manufacture of flour are cacua or kofo, large basket made of wicker or vine, usually in pairs, without a lid and with handles, which are attached to the cangalhas to transport the manioc from the plantation to the flour mill in the case of small production. Cangalha or cambito, wooden bulkhead used on the back of pack animals to fix the cacuas. Kaitatu or bola, the main part of cassava grading equipment. It is a wooden cylinder with a metal axis with small teeth to which metal serrations are adapted and which has one of the ends in the form of a pulley where the belt fits, so that, through it, a fast rotational movement is printed, activated by motor or manually. The graded mass granulometry is controlled by regulating the opening between the serration and the mobile regulating board, called the arrival. Generally, the graded mass falls directly into the trough. Trough, piece of wood dug like a canoe, used to store peeled roots, to crush the dough before passing it through the pressing, to store the graded dough and to put the toasted flour. It can also be in concrete. Paneros, wicker or vine baskets used to store the graded dough. Pestle, type of large wooden bowl where cassava is placed to be pounded until the grading process is completed. Presses, used to separate the liquid, manipura, from the mass. They are usually made of wood and operated by a lever or screw. In the case of a screw, it is usually made of hardwood with a diameter of approximately 20 centimeters. Instead of the screw, a windlass can be used. These are efficient processes, but require frequent tightening. The force of the bolt, or windlass, is applied to the end of the lintel. This force is transmitted as compression to the press cover, with a magnitude proportional to the lever arm. Instead of the screw and the windlass, it is common to use a weight hanging from the end of the lintel. Such weight, usually stones on a platform, acts with the same force at all times, dispensing with the constant interventions necessary in other methods. Scraper and knives, instruments used to peel/scrape cassava. Roasting pan, large clay or iron dishes or bowls placed inside the oven to dry the dough. Also called oven when formed by slabs and, in this case, heated by wood. Tipatai, type of long basket, braided in vegetable fibers, used to squeeze, when strongly stretched, the dough. Squeegee, made of wood and used to stir dough in the pan or oven during toasting. Sieves, one of larger granulometry to sieve the dough and another of smaller granulometry to sieve the flour. The bulk of the flour is called rollout. Grading, after cleaning, the roots are grated, often forming a soggy mass. The degree of fineness of the grading is important to avoid losses after sieving, thus reducing the amount of raw material. Primarily, cassava can also be graded by rubbing it on a hard and rough surface, such as a stone slab. Pressing, the mass after grading is compressed, usually with the use of a tipatai or with a wooden press. In the wooden press, the mass is arranged in several layers separated by permeable bags, to facilitate later removal and handling. At this stage, the liquid extracted from the dough, manipura or manipura, is highly polluting and toxic, and can kill if ingested by people or animals. For a very small amount of dough, the dough can be dried manually by twisting and squeezing it with the aid of a porous fabric. Crushing. To avoid fermentation and browning of the flour, pressing must take place as soon as possible after grading, and then, for the same reason, the compacted mass must be crumbled as quickly as possible. For better crumbling, the mass can be passed through the peccary again, because in addition to being fast, with mechanized driving force, it facilitates subsequent sieving. In just 18 hours after grading, in tropical climates, there will certainly be fermentation, which will give the final product an acrid flavor unsuitable for consumption. Sieving. Sieving separates the smaller fragments from the larger ones, both dough and flour, homogenizing the weight of the flour, thus providing better quality. The fragments retained in the sieve are called cruera, and after drying it can be consumed by animals without damage. Toasting. The dough, after passing through sieving, is placed in the oven to remove moisture, being constantly stirred by the oven, Farinha, through a squeegee. To avoid contamination and fermentation, it is recommended that the cleaning, grating, pressing, crumbling, sieving and roasting phases take place in the same environment. The granulation of the flour, the oven temperature, the exposure time of the flour in the oven, and the technique of mixing the flour are the main factors that influence the type produced. The flavor and consistency of each type varies mainly by the granulation of the flour, the amount of starch and the drying, roasting, state of the flour. If the starch is removed from the dough for another use, through successive washing, the flour loses a little quality due to the absence of the heavier powdery material. If it is roasted more than necessary, the flour takes on an inappropriate reddish tone, and if it remains in the oven for a long time at a temperature below the ideal temperature, the dough dries up, but does not toast, and the flour does not acquire its characteristic flavor. It is also recommended, for better flour quality, 2 ovens, one with a milder temperature, where the dough will only be dried, from where it will go to a hotter oven where it will be finely toasted. This measure is important, because if the dough is still wet and falls into a very hot oven, it will form cakes and the flour will come out thick.